I raised my glass on our 20th wedding anniversary while my husband sat across from me with his mistress on his arm. The entire restaurant had gone quiet. He thought he had already won. He thought bringing her tonight would finally break me, humiliate me in front of everyone who knew us. So I smiled. Not the kind of smile a wife gives when she forgives, but the kind you give when the ending has already been written. My phone buzzed under the table. One message from my lawyer. It's done. I looked at my husband, lifted my glass a little higher, and said calmly, "Tonight, we're celebrating something special." He didn't know it yet, but at that exact moment, he had just lost his company, every dollar in his accounts, and the only woman who had been quietly holding his entire empire together for 20 years. If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from? And what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. The candle between us had already burned halfway down when I checked my watch again. 20 years of marriage, and Daniel was late to our anniversary dinner. The restaurant overlooked the harbor, quiet and dim, the kind of place where people spoke softly, and the waiters moved like shadows between tables. Daniel used to say this place was perfect for important nights, promotions, big deals, celebrations, anniversaries. Tonight was supposed to be one of those nights. I sat alone with 2 glasses of wine on the table, watching the condensation slowly slide down the stem of the one meant for him. My fingers kept turning my wedding ring without me noticing. Round and round, the metal warm against my skin. 20 years. It was strange how a number that large could feel so hollow. A waiter approached carefully, leaning down just enough to keep his voice discreet. "Would you like me to bring the main course now, ma'am?" he asked. I gave him a polite smile that felt heavier than it should have. "Not yet," I said. "My husband should be here any minute." He nodded and stepped away, but I caught the look in his eyes, the quiet sympathy people try to hide when they think they're witnessing something awkward. I understood that look. Daniel had been late before. Work meetings, traffic, clients who needed one more drink before signing a deal. There was always a reason, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the empty chair across from me. Maybe it was the way the other couples leaned toward each other under candlelight, laughing softly like they belonged in the same story. Or maybe it was the quiet buzzing in my purse every few minutes, messages I hadn't opened yet. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip of wine just as the restaurant door opened. I didn't look right away. After 20 years of marriage, you develop a strange instinct for your spouse's presence, a shift in the air. The rhythm of footsteps you've heard thousands of times. So when I finally raised my eyes toward the entrance, something inside me tightened before my mind even understood why. Daniel stood in the doorway, tall and composed in the navy suit he usually wore to board meetings. His hair was neatly combed back, the way he styled it when he wanted to look particularly confident. For a brief moment, relief flickered through me. He had made it. Then I noticed the woman standing beside him. Young. That was the first thing I registered. She couldn't have been older than 30. Long, dark hair rested over her shoulders, and her dress caught the warm light of the restaurant in soft, shimmering lines. Her hand rested easily on Daniel's arm, not awkwardly, not like someone unsure of her place, comfortably, as if that was exactly where her hand belonged. The tight feeling in my chest deepened, but my face stayed still. I watched as Daniel scanned the room and found me. A small smile curved across his lips, the confident one he used during negotiations, the smile that made people believe he already knew how everything would end. Then he started walking toward the table. The woman walked beside him as if she had been invited. Their pace was calm, almost relaxed, like this evening had been planned exactly this way. As they passed other tables, conversations softened. I noticed the waiter pause mid-step with a wine bottle tilted slightly in his hand. People were watching now, though they tried not to make it obvious. Daniel reached the table first and looked down at me with the same composed expression he wore in boardrooms. "Sorry I'm late," he said lightly, as though being 20 minutes late to a dinner like this required no further explanation. Before I could respond, he stepped slightly to the side and gestured toward the woman beside him. "This is Vanessa." She smiled brightly, polite and smooth, in a way that reminded me of networking events and cocktail parties. "Hi," she said softly. I didn't answer. My eyes were still on Daniel, waiting for the moment he would correct the situation, waiting for the awkward laugh that would follow. The explanation, she's a colleague. She needed a ride. This isn't what it looks like. But Daniel didn't say anything else. Instead, he reached for the empty chair across from me, the same chair he had pulled out for me every anniversary for 20 years. For a brief moment, my heart paused, almost expecting the familiar gesture. Then he pulled the chair back and turned toward Vanessa. Without hesitation, he held it out for her, his hand resting lightly on the back of the seat as she stepped forward. And in that quiet, candlelit restaurant where we had celebrated every anniversary of our marriage, my husband calmly invited his mistress to sit in my place. Vanessa lowered herself into the chair slowly, smoothing the fabric of her dress as if she had every right to be there. Daniel pushed the chair in behind her with the same careful care he had shown me on every anniversary for the past 20 years. The same small gesture. The same ritual that used to mean something. Tonight, he didn't even glance at me while doing it. Instead, he walked around the table and took the seat beside her, leaving me sitting alone across from them. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The candle between us flickered softly, its light bending in the faint breeze from the ceiling vent. Somewhere behind Daniel, silverware touched a plate with a quiet metallic sound. Conversations continued around us, but softer now, like the room itself was leaning closer to watch what would happen next. I noticed the waiter who had served me earlier lingering near another table, pretending to adjust the placement of a fork while glancing toward us every few seconds. Daniel reached for the wine list as if nothing about the moment was unusual. "You already ordered?" he asked casually, nodding toward the glasses on the table. "Yes," I replied. My voice sounded calm, almost distant, like it belonged to someone watching the scene from across the room rather than living inside it. Vanessa glanced between the two of us and offered another polite smile, though this one seemed a little tighter than before. Up close, she looked even younger than I first thought, early 30s at most. Her long dark hair fell neatly over one shoulder as she leaned back comfortably in the chair that had been mine every anniversary since we first discovered this restaurant. "This place is beautiful," she said lightly, looking around at the harbor lights glowing through the windows. "I can see why you like it." Daniel chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, we've been coming here for years." The word "we" lingered strangely in the air. I lifted my wine glass and took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become noticeable. Daniel didn't seem bothered by it. If anything, he looked relaxed, like a man who believed he controlled the room simply by sitting in it. I placed the glass back on the table and looked straight at him. "So," I said quietly. Daniel raised one eyebrow slightly. "So?" he repeated. "Is there something you want to explain?" Vanessa shifted almost imperceptibly in her chair. Her fingers moved closer to Daniel's arm on the table, close enough that she could touch him if she wanted to. Daniel leaned back in his seat and studied me the same way he did in meetings when someone asked a question he thought was unnecessary. "What exactly needs explaining?" he asked. I held his gaze. "You brought her," I said, "to our anniversary dinner." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he let out a short breath, almost amused. "Relax," he said lightly. "It's just dinner." The words landed on the table between us like something small but heavy. Vanessa gave a quick laugh that stopped almost as soon as it started, as if she wasn't entirely sure whether the situation was supposed to be funny. Daniel reached for his wine glass and took a slow sip, completely unbothered by the way the restaurant had grown quieter around us. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," he added. I watched him carefully, studying the tiny expressions that passed across his face. After 20 years, I knew them all: the look he wore when he believed he had already won, the calm confidence that appeared whenever he thought the other person had no real move left to make. Just then the waiter returned, his professional smile stretched a little tighter than before. "Are you ready to order?" he asked. Daniel didn't even open the menu. 3 steaks. "Medium," he said immediately. The waiter hesitated for half a second and glanced toward me, probably wondering whether I wanted to confirm the order myself. I gave a small nod. "That's fine." He scribbled something quickly onto his pad and left the table again. Vanessa seemed to relax slightly after the interruption, like the brief normalcy of ordering dinner gave her permission to breathe again. "Daniel told me you two built an amazing life together," she said carefully, turning toward me with that same polished smile. The sentence sounded rehearsed, like something she had practiced earlier in the evening. Daniel smiled faintly. "We did all right," he said. "Did." Past tense. My thumb turned the wedding ring slowly around my finger again, the metal sliding against my skin. At that moment, my purse vibrated softly against the side of my chair. A short, quiet buzz. No one else seemed to notice. I slipped my hand down beside me and pulled out my phone beneath the table, shielding the screen from view. One new message had appeared. It was from my lawyer. 4 simple words filled the screen. "It's done. Effective now." I stared at the message for a few seconds, feeling something deep inside my chest settle into a calm, steady stillness. Then I locked the phone and placed it quietly back in my purse. When I looked up again, Daniel was watching me. "Everything okay?" he asked casually. I smiled, not wide, just enough. "Yes," I said softly. Then I reached for the bottle of wine and began pouring more into Vanessa's glass. "Everything," I added calmly, "is perfectly fine." The wine flowed slowly into Vanessa's glass, the deep red liquid catching the candlelight as it climbed toward the rim. My hand didn't tremble, not even slightly. Vanessa watched the glass fill with a small, uncertain smile, as if she wasn't entirely sure whether this gesture was kindness or something else she couldn't yet name. "Thank you," she said quietly. Daniel leaned back in his chair and observed the moment with mild curiosity, like a man watching a small experiment unfold. I placed the bottle down and lifted my own glass, letting the silence stretch for a few seconds before speaking. "You should enjoy the wine," I said calmly, glancing at Vanessa. "It's the most expensive bottle they have here." Daniel let out a short laugh. "Still have expensive taste," he said. I met his eyes across the table. "Some things don't change." Vanessa raised the glass carefully and took a small sip. Her eyebrows lifted in quiet approval. "It's really good," she said. "It should be," Daniel replied casually. "They charge enough for it." For a moment, the three of us sat there in a strange, suspended stillness. Around us, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, low conversations, soft music drifting from hidden speakers, the occasional clink of glasses meeting in quiet toasts. Daniel looked completely comfortable inside it all, like a man who believed the evening belonged entirely to him. Then he looked at me again. "You're being very calm," he said. His voice wasn't mocking. If anything, it carried a trace of curiosity. I tilted my head slightly. "Should I be screaming?" Vanessa's eyes moved quickly between us. Daniel shrugged one shoulder. "Some women might." I took another slow sip of wine before answering. "Yes," I said quietly. "Some women might." He studied my face then, searching for something: anger, hurt, humiliation, something that would confirm the version of this evening he had imagined when he decided to walk through that door with another woman on his arm. But there was nothing there for him to find, just composure. At that moment, the waiter returned and placed a basket of warm bread and a small dish of olive oil at the center of the table. His movements were quick and professional, though I noticed the careful way he avoided meeting any of our eyes for too long. "Your steaks will be ready shortly," he said before stepping away again. As soon as he left, Vanessa reached for a piece of bread and broke it gently between her fingers. "Daniel told me you two met in college," she said, her voice light but slightly cautious. "That's right," I replied. "Business school?" she asked. Daniel chuckled softly. "No. She was smarter than that." I raised one eyebrow. "I studied finance," I said. Vanessa looked impressed. "Really?" Daniel waved his hand dismissively, as if the detail wasn't particularly important. "Her family was already in finance," he said. "She didn't really have to work as hard as the rest of us." I watched him while he spoke, the easy confidence in his voice, the casual certainty that he understood every part of our shared history better than anyone else. For 20 years, Daniel had told the story of our marriage the same way. In his version, he was the one who built everything from nothing. I was simply the woman standing beside him while it happened. Vanessa dipped her bread into the olive oil and looked back at me. "So what do you do now?" she asked politely. Daniel answered before I could. "She manages investments," he said. Mostly family stuff. The faintest smile touched the corner of my mouth. "That's one way to describe it," I said. Daniel didn't notice. He had already picked up his phone, glancing at the screen quickly before placing it back on the table beside his plate. For a moment, The table returned to silence again. Then his phone vibrated once. Daniel looked down casually and picked it up, clearly expecting something ordinary, a message from an assistant, perhaps, or a reminder about a meeting. But as his eyes moved across the screen, something changed. It was subtle, but I saw it immediately. His relaxed smile faded just a little. He read the message again, slower this time. Then he looked up at me. Not casually, not confidently, differently. I lifted my glass and took another quiet sip of wine, holding his gaze across the table. And for the first time that evening, Daniel looked uncertain. Daniel stared at his phone a few seconds longer than someone normally would. To anyone else, the pause might have seemed insignificant, but after 20 years of marriage, I had learned to recognize even the smallest shift in him, the tightening of his jaw, the slight delay before he spoke, the way his eyes lingered on something just a little too long. Something in that message had disturbed him. Not enough to break his confidence completely, but enough to ripple the surface of it. Vanessa noticed the pause too, and leaned slightly toward him. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. Daniel blinked and turned the phone face down on the table, as if the movement alone could make the message disappear. "Yeah," he said quickly. "Just work." The answer came out too fast, the kind of reply people give when they want the conversation to end before it begins. He reached for his wineglass and took a sip, but I saw his eyes drift back toward the phone for the briefest moment before he leaned back in his chair again. "Sorry," he added lightly, forcing a casual shrug. "Things never really stop." Vanessa nodded with the polite sympathy of someone who thought she understood the pressures of a busy career. "I can imagine," she said. I didn't say anything. I simply watched him. The waiter returned, then carrying 3 plates, the warm smell of grilled steak drifting across the table as he set each dish down with quiet efficiency. "Medium steak," he said before stepping away again. Daniel immediately picked up his knife and fork. "Let's eat before it gets cold," he said, as if continuing the routine of dinner might restore the control he felt slipping. Vanessa followed his lead, cutting a small piece of steak and taking a bite. "This is amazing," she said with an appreciative smile. "It should be," Daniel replied, though his voice sounded slightly distracted now. His movements had changed without him noticing. The confident rhythm he usually carried through every action had slowed, replaced by the subtle hesitation of someone thinking about something else entirely. Vanessa seemed to sense it too. "Long day?" she asked gently. Daniel forced a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Something like that." His gaze flickered toward the phone again just as it vibrated against the tablecloth. The soft buzz seemed louder than it should have been. This time Daniel picked it up immediately. Vanessa leaned closer, curiosity brightening her expression. "More work?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes moved across the screen once, then again more slowly. I watched the moment the meaning settled in. The color faded slightly from his face. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough for me. Across the table, I lifted my glass and took a slow sip of wine. Daniel lowered the phone, but didn't set it down immediately. His fingers still wrapped around it like he wasn't sure whether to read the message again. "What is it?" Vanessa asked, her voice softer now. "Nothing," Daniel said. The word sounded thinner than before, stripped of the easy confidence he had carried into the restaurant earlier that evening. I placed my glass back on the table and looked at him calmly. "You should check it," I said gently. Daniel's eyes moved to me again, really looking this time instead of glancing past me the way he had all night. "Why would you say that?" he asked. I shrugged slightly and cut another small piece of steak. "No reason," I said. The silence that followed felt heavier than any before it. Vanessa looked between us, clearly aware that something had changed even if she didn't know what. Daniel slowly turned the phone in his hand and glanced down at the screen again, his brow tightening as he read. When he lifted his head, the confidence he had walked into the restaurant with was no longer sitting comfortably on his face, and for the first time that night, Daniel didn't look annoyed or amused. He looked worried. Daniel kept the phone in his hand a moment longer before setting it face down beside his plate. The motion looked controlled, but I could see the tension in the way his fingers lingered on the edge of the device before letting go. After 20 years of marriage, you learn to recognize even the smallest change in someone. A pause that lasts half a second too long, a smile that doesn't quite return to the eyes. Daniel had built his entire reputation on calm authority. the kind of man who never looked surprised by anything, especially in public. But the message he had just read had cracked that composure, even if only slightly. Vanessa noticed it too. She leaned toward him a little, lowering her voice. "Are you sure everything's okay?" Daniel forced a quick smile and picked up his knife and fork. "It's nothing serious," he said. "Just something from the office." The answer sounded practiced, the kind of line people say when they want a conversation to end before it begins. He cut into his steak. Though the movement lacked the smooth confidence he had earlier, the blade pressed harder than necessary before sliding through the meat. I lifted my glass and took a small sip of wine, watching him quietly. For years I had watched Daniel handle pressure in exactly the same way. Calm voice, relaxed posture, the quiet certainty of a man who believed every situation could be managed if he simply stayed in control long enough. But tonight something had shifted beneath that surface. Vanessa tried to lighten the mood. "You run a company," she said with a casual laugh. "I'm sure problems pop up all the time." Daniel nodded quickly. "Exactly." Yet his eyes flicked toward the phone again, just for a second. The screen lit faintly against the white tablecloth. Another message. Daniel's jaw tightened before he could hide it. Vanessa noticed immediately. "Another one?" Daniel picked up the phone again, slower this time. His eyes moved across the screen as he read. Then he stopped moving altogether. Across the table, I set my fork down quietly. Around us, the restaurant continued its soft rhythm, low conversations, the distant clink of glasses, but at our table the air felt different now, heavier somehow. Daniel read the message again, his brow tightening slightly. "What is it?" Vanessa asked. Daniel lowered the phone just enough to speak. "The board scheduled an emergency meeting," he said. Vanessa blinked. "An emergency meeting? Tonight?" Daniel shook his head. "Tomorrow morning." His voice was steady, but the confidence that had filled it earlier in the evening had thinned. I reached for a small piece of bread and dipped it slowly into the olive oil before speaking. "Emergency meetings usually mean something serious," I said calmly. Daniel's eyes moved to me immediately. For a moment he didn't answer, as if weighing something in his head. Vanessa looked between us, clearly sensing the tension even if she didn't understand its cause. Daniel finally placed the phone back on the table, but this time he didn't flip it face down. The screen stayed visible beside his plate, glowing faintly in the candlelight. "It's probably nothing," he said, though the words sounded more like reassurance than certainty. I took another bite of bread and wiped my fingers carefully with the napkin. "Then you shouldn't worry," I said lightly. Daniel watched me for a long moment. The easy confidence he had walked into the restaurant with earlier that evening was gone now, replaced by something sharper, more alert. His fingers tapped once against the table beside the phone. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair. "Funny timing," he said quietly. I raised an eyebrow. "Funny how?" Daniel didn't look at Vanessa when he answered. His eyes stayed fixed on me. "That email," he said slowly, "arrived about 5 minutes after you checked your phone." Daniel's words lingered in the air for a moment, heavy and deliberate, as if he had placed them carefully between us to see how I would react. The candlelight trembled faintly across the table, reflecting in the untouched wine still sitting in Vanessa's glass. I held his gaze calmly and let the silence stretch just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable before answering. "That sounds like a coincidence," I said lightly. Daniel didn't smile. His eyes remained fixed on my face, searching with the same quiet intensity he used during negotiations, the look that had unsettled countless employees and competitors over the years. Across the table, Vanessa shifted in her chair, clearly sensing the tension, but not understanding it. "Wait," she said softly. "What does her phone have to do with a board meeting?" Daniel didn't respond to her right away. His fingers hovered near his phone again, tapping once against the table before going still. "Probably nothing," he said after a moment, though the certainty in his voice had thinned. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip of wine. "You said the meeting is tomorrow morning," I replied calmly. "That gives you plenty of time to find out what it's about." Daniel leaned back slightly, studying me the way a chess player studies a board when a move doesn't make sense yet. For the first time that evening, his attention had narrowed completely. The restaurant, the food, even the woman beside him seemed to fade from his focus. Vanessa cleared her throat, attempting to soften the tension that had settled over the table. "Maybe it's just a financial report," she offered with a small shrug. Companies do that all the time. Daniel's gaze never left mine. Not like this, he said quietly. I folded my hands loosely on the table. Then what do you think it is? Daniel hesitated. It was a small pause, but after 20 years I recognized it instantly. I don't know yet, he said. But the board doesn't schedule emergency meetings without a reason. A waiter passed behind Daniel just then, refilling water glasses at a nearby table before continuing toward the kitchen. The brief interruption softened the tension for half a second before Daniel's phone vibrated again. The sound was soft but unmistakable. All three of us glanced down at the screen. Daniel picked it up immediately. His eyes moved quickly across the message, and the change in his expression this time was clearer than before. The confidence he had been trying to rebuild slipped again, replaced by something sharper calculation. "What is it now?" Vanessa asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. His thumb scrolled slowly across the screen before he lowered the phone slightly. "They added 2 more people to the meeting," he said. "From the legal department," Vanessa frowned. "Legal?" Daniel nodded once, though his attention had already returned to me. I allowed the faintest smile to touch the corner of my mouth before hiding it behind my glass. "That doesn't sound like a routine update," I said. Daniel's eyes sharpened instantly. "No," he agreed quietly. "It doesn't." For a moment neither of us spoke. The restaurant around us continued its gentle hum of conversations and quiet laughter, but at our table everything felt strangely still. Vanessa looked between us again, confusion written clearly across her face. "Can someone explain what's happening?" she asked. Daniel finally turned toward her, though his thoughts were clearly somewhere else now. "Probably some compliance issue," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. He glanced down at the phone once more before locking the screen and placing it beside his plate. Then his eyes returned to me, studying my face again, as if he were seeing it differently for the first time in years. "You seem very calm tonight," he said slowly. I gave a small shrug. "Well, it is our anniversary," I replied. Daniel held my gaze a moment longer before speaking again, his voice quieter now. "Yes," he said, "and somehow everything in my company starts going wrong on the same night." Daniel's words from a moment ago still lingered between us, the quiet accusation wrapped inside them settling over the table like a thin layer of frost. For several seconds no one spoke. The restaurant continued its gentle rhythm around us, soft music, low conversations, the faint clink of glasses, but our table felt strangely separate from it all. Daniel watched me carefully now, not with the careless confidence he had carried into the restaurant earlier that evening, but with the focused attention of someone beginning to suspect that the situation in front of him might not be as simple as he believed. Vanessa shifted slightly in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that had formed. "I'm sure it's just bad timing," she said softly, attempting a reassuring smile. "Companies have problems every day." Daniel didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on me, as if he were searching for something beneath my calm expression. I reached for the bread basket and tore off a small piece before dipping it slowly into the olive oil. "Companies do have problems every day," I said evenly. "But emergency meetings that involve the legal department usually mean someone is worried about liability." Daniel's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Vanessa frowned slightly and glanced between us. "Liability?" she repeated. Daniel finally turned toward her. "It's nothing," he said automatically, though the certainty in his voice had faded. At that moment his phone vibrated again. The sound seemed louder this time. Daniel picked it up immediately and looked down at the screen. His eyes moved quickly at first, then slowed as he read the message again more carefully. I watched the subtle change in his posture, the slight pause in his breathing that came when something unexpected landed. Vanessa leaned closer, curiosity beginning to outweigh her earlier hesitation. "What is it now?" she asked. Daniel lowered the phone slightly but didn't set it down. "The board just circulated a preliminary report," he said. Vanessa blinked. "A report about what?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. "Financial irregularities." The words settled heavily between us. Vanessa straightened in her chair. "Irregularities? What kind of irregularities?" Daniel didn't respond immediately. His eyes had already lifted back to me again. I rested my hands loosely on the table, meeting his gaze without urgency. "That sounds serious," I said quietly. "It might be," Daniel replied. For a moment, the three of us sat in silence again. A waiter passed nearby carrying a tray of drinks, the glasses clinking softly together as he moved between tables. Around us, other couples continued their dinners, unaware that the atmosphere at our table had shifted entirely. Vanessa spoke again, her voice cautious now. "Maybe it's just an accounting mistake," she suggested. "Things like that happen." Daniel's attention returned to the phone in his hand. His thumb moved slowly across the screen as he scrolled through the message. "They're reviewing several transactions," he said finally. "Large ones." Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. "How large?" Daniel didn't answer her. He was still reading. I lifted my glass and took a small sip of wine before speaking. "Large transactions usually leave a very clear trail," I said calmly. Daniel's head lifted sharply. "You seem to know a lot about this," he said. I gave a faint shrug. "I studied finance," I reminded him. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, still holding the phone. The candlelight reflected faintly across the screen and into his eyes. The man who had walked into the restaurant earlier that evening expecting to control the entire situation now looked like someone reconsidering the board in front of him. He glanced down at the phone again, then back at me. This time his voice was quieter. "According to this report," he said slowly, "someone just froze 3 of our corporate accounts." The words Daniel had just spoken lingered in the air between us. Someone just froze 3 of our corporate accounts. He didn't look away after saying it. His eyes remained fixed on my face, studying it carefully, searching for the smallest reaction that might confirm the suspicion slowly forming in his mind. I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, while the quiet hum of the restaurant continued around us. Vanessa shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that had settled at the table. "What does that mean?" she asked cautiously. Daniel glanced down at the phone again before replying. "It means someone with proper authorization requested a freeze on several company accounts," he said slowly. Vanessa frowned. "Why would anyone do that?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. His attention had already drifted back toward me. I picked up my napkin and folded it carefully beside my plate before speaking. "Sometimes accounts get frozen during internal reviews," I said calmly, "especially if the company suspects financial exposure." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "That kind of request doesn't come from outside," he said. "It comes from someone who has access to the company's financial structure." Vanessa looked between us, clearly trying to piece the conversation together. "So someone inside the company did this?" she asked. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the phone still resting in his hand. "It would have to be someone with the right authority," he said. For a moment, no one spoke. A waiter passed behind us carrying a tray of drinks, and the faint clink of glass briefly filled the space between our words. Vanessa tried again, her voice uncertain now. "Maybe it's just a mistake," she said. "Banks make errors sometimes." Daniel shook his head slightly. "Banks don't freeze corporate accounts by mistake." His thumb moved across the phone screen as he continued reading. The faint line between his eyebrows deepened as he reached the next part of the message. "What else does it say?" Vanessa asked quietly. Daniel exhaled through his nose before answering. "The request came through our legal authorization channel," he said, "which means whoever submitted it had full access to our financial authorization system." Vanessa blinked. "Is that bad?" Daniel gave a short, humorless breath of laughter. "Yes," he said, "it's very bad." I leaned back slightly in my chair. "If the legal department is involved," I said calmly, "they're probably preparing for something bigger than a routine review." Daniel's gaze snapped back to me immediately. "You sound very certain about that," he said. I gave a small shrug. "Situations like this follow patterns," I replied. Daniel leaned forward slightly now, his attention sharpening. "And where exactly would you have seen those patterns?" he asked. "In finance," I said simply. For a moment, neither of us moved. Vanessa watched the exchange with growing confusion, like someone sitting through a conversation in a language she only partly understood. Daniel glanced back down at the phone again and scrolled further through the report. The candlelight reflected faintly off the screen as he read the final section. Then his posture shifted. "What now?" Vanessa asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes lifted from the phone and returned to me, this time with unmistakable suspicion. "The report lists the authorization source," he said slowly. I tilted my head slightly. "And?" Daniel placed the phone on the table, though his fingers still rested against the edge of it. The request was submitted less than an hour ago, he continued. Vanessa leaned forward. Whose authorization was it? Daniel didn't look at her when he answered. His eyes stayed locked on mine. It says the freeze was requested through a private financial proxy, he said quietly. The restaurant noise seemed to fade into the background as the meaning of his words settled over the table. I held his gaze without reacting. Daniel's voice dropped slightly lower when he spoke again. And that proxy, he said slowly, is connected to a family investment account, one tied directly to your family. Daniel's last words hung in the air between us, heavy and deliberate. One tied directly to your family. He didn't blink after saying it. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, studying my face carefully, as if he expected the truth to reveal itself in some tiny involuntary reaction. I met his gaze calmly and let the silence stretch for several seconds while the quiet murmur of the restaurant continued around us. Vanessa shifted in her chair, clearly unsettled by the tension building at the table. Wait, she said slowly. Her family? Daniel still didn't look at her. His attention remained locked on me. According to the report, he said quietly, the authorization passed through a private financial proxy connected to a family investment structure. Vanessa frowned. I'm not sure I understand what that means. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. It means someone connected to that investment account had the authority to freeze corporate funds. For a moment, none of us spoke. The candlelight flickered faintly between us, reflecting in the dark surface of Daniel's phone screen. I folded my hands loosely together on the table before speaking. You're drawing a lot of conclusions from a preliminary report, I said calmly. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening. I'm not drawing conclusions, he replied. I'm reading exactly what it says. Vanessa looked between us again, her confusion turning into visible concern. Are you saying she did this? She asked Daniel. Daniel didn't answer right away. He was still watching me. I lifted my glass and took a small sip before placing it back on the table. You said the board meeting is tomorrow morning, I said evenly. If there's a real problem, they'll explain it then. Daniel gave a quiet, humorless breath of laughter. That's the problem, he said. The board already believes there is one. His thumb moved slowly across the screen as he reread the message. They're reviewing a series of large transfers connected to that same investment structure. Vanessa blinked. Transfers? What kind of transfers? Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Corporate liquidity movements, he said. Funds routed through our accounts over the past few months. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, clearly struggling to follow the conversation now. But I thought you controlled the company, she said to Daniel. Wouldn't you know about something like that? Daniel didn't respond to her immediately. His attention lifted from the phone and returned to me again. That depends, he said slowly, on who authorized them. I gave a faint shrug. Companies move money constantly, I said. Investments, restructuring, acquisitions. Daniel studied my face carefully. Not like this, he replied. The waiter passed behind our table carrying a tray of empty glasses, the quiet clinking briefly filling the space between us. Vanessa finally broke the silence again. Can someone please explain what's going on? She asked. Daniel answered without looking at her. The board believes someone redirected corporate liquidity through an outside investment vehicle, he said. Vanessa's eyes widened. That sounds illegal. It might be, Daniel said quietly. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Or it might be authorized restructuring, I said. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Authorized by who? He asked. I met his gaze without hesitation. Someone with the right authority. The words lingered between us. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the phone in his hand. For a moment, he seemed to weigh something in his mind, then he looked down at the screen again. His thumb scrolled slowly through the report until he reached the final section. Then he stopped moving. Vanessa noticed the change first. What now? She asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. When he finally looked up again, the suspicion in his expression had sharpened into something colder. This report just updated, he said quietly. I raised an eyebrow. And Daniel slowly placed the phone on the table and turned the screen toward me. The candlelight reflected faintly across the glass as the message filled the display. The authorization record just finalized, he said. For a brief moment, the restaurant noise seemed to fade. Daniel's voice dropped lower when he spoke again. And the primary beneficiary listed on that proxy account. He looked straight into my eyes. Is you. Daniel's final words hung between us like a weight pressing down on the table. The primary beneficiary is you. For a moment, none of us moved. The soft music in the restaurant continued, and somewhere across the room someone laughed quietly, but the world at our table had narrowed to the space between Daniel's phone and my face. Vanessa stared at me as if she had suddenly realized she had walked into something far more complicated than a simple dinner. Wait, she said slowly, her voice tight with disbelief. You're saying she froze your company's accounts? Daniel didn't answer her. His eyes remained fixed on me, sharp now, studying every movement of my face the way a man studies a document that might contain a hidden clause. I glanced briefly at the phone screen he had turned toward me, where the authorization line still glowed faintly in the candlelight, and then I leaned back slightly in my chair. You look surprised, I said quietly. Daniel's expression hardened. Shouldn't I be? He replied. Vanessa looked between us again, clearly lost. Someone please explain what's happening. Daniel spoke without looking away from me. The corporate accounts were frozen through a proxy tied to her family's investment structure, he said. And according to this report, she's the primary beneficiary. Vanessa slowly turned back toward me. The confidence she had carried into the restaurant earlier that evening had completely disappeared. Is that true? She asked. And I folded my hands loosely on the table. You're reading a report written by people who are still trying to understand what happened, I said calmly. Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. So you're not denying it? I held his gaze. I didn't say that. For several seconds, Daniel didn't speak. The composure he had walked into the restaurant with earlier, the smug confidence of a man certain he controlled the evening, had begun to crack. Vanessa watched the two of us like someone observing a match she had never intended to attend. Finally, Daniel leaned forward slightly. Why would you freeze my company's accounts? He asked. Daniel had said my company. I shook my head almost imperceptibly. Our company, I corrected quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened. That company exists because of me, he said. I tilted my head slightly. That's an interesting way to remember it. Vanessa frowned. What does that mean? Daniel ignored her again, his attention narrowing on me. That investment was a minority stake 20 years ago, he said. Yes, I replied calmly. 20 years ago. Daniel's expression shifted slightly. What's that supposed to mean? Vanessa asked. Daniel didn't answer her. He was staring at me now, searching through his memory. You're implying something changed, he said slowly. I adjusted the napkin beside my plate before answering. You remember the original capital structure, I said. My family's fund provided the initial liquidity that allowed the company to open its first office. Daniel's eyes flickered. That was decades ago, he said. True, I replied, but the legal structure behind it never disappeared. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, trying to follow the conversation. What legal structure? Daniel spoke before I could answer. You're talking about the contingency clause, he said. I met his gaze without blinking. Daniel's voice dropped lower. That clause was never activated. I leaned back in my chair again, letting the words settle before responding. That depends on how you read the contract. Daniel's fingers tightened against the edge of the table. For the first time since he had walked into the restaurant, he looked genuinely unsettled. You can't freeze corporate funds because of a technicality, he said. I raised an eyebrow. It's not a technicality, I replied quietly. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Then what is it? For a moment, I didn't answer. I simply looked at him while the quiet murmur of the restaurant continued around us. Then I spoke. It's a control clause. Daniel's expression hardened. That clause only activates if the board determines the company is exposed to serious financial risk. I nodded once. Yes. Daniel leaned forward again, his voice lower now. And who exactly convinced the board there was a financial risk tonight? Daniel's question lingered between us like a blade suspended in the air. And who exactly convinced the board there was a financial risk tonight? He didn't blink after asking it. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, searching for the reaction that might confirm what he was already beginning to understand. For a moment, I didn't answer. I simply looked back at him while the quiet hum of the restaurant carried on around us, glasses clinking, low conversations drifting between tables, a waiter laughing softly somewhere near the bar. None of it seemed to reach our table. Vanessa shifted uneasily in her chair. "I feel like I'm missing something important," she said carefully. "Can someone please explain what's going on?" Daniel didn't look at her. His attention never left my face. "I asked you a question," he said quietly. I folded my hands together on the table and met his gaze without hesitation. "You already know the answer," I said. For the first time that evening, Daniel looked genuinely stunned. The confident composure he had carried into the restaurant earlier, the smug certainty that he controlled the moment, the dinner, even the humiliation he thought he was delivering began to slip away. In its place was something slower and heavier, realization. Vanessa looked between us again, her voice tightening. "Wait, are you saying she went to the board?" Daniel finally spoke, though his voice had dropped. "You went to the board behind my back." I tilted my head slightly. "Behind your back?" I repeated calmly. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Yes," he said, "behind my back." I leaned back slightly in my chair. "That board exists to oversee the company," I said evenly. "That's literally its purpose." Vanessa stared at me, her confusion deepening. "But why would you do that?" Daniel answered before I could. "Because she wants control," he said. The word control hung in the air between us. I let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Control?" I repeated quietly. Daniel leaned forward now, both hands flat on the table, his posture rigid with anger. "You triggered the clause," he said. "You convinced them the company was at risk." I held his gaze steadily. "Yes," I said. Vanessa blinked in shock. "You actually did that?" Daniel shook his head slowly, disbelief spreading across his face. "You went to the board tonight," he said, "froze corporate accounts, and triggered a control clause just to make a point." I shook my head gently. "You still don't understand," I said. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Then explain it." For a moment, I didn't answer. Instead, I glanced around the restaurant. Couples were finishing their dinners. Waiters moved quietly between tables. Through the tall windows, the harbor lights shimmered against the dark water outside. Then I looked back at him. "You brought your mistress to our 20th anniversary dinner," I said calmly. Vanessa stiffened beside him. Daniel didn't move. "You thought tonight would humiliate me," I continued quietly. "That I would sit here and pretend not to notice." Daniel's expression shifted slightly, but he still said nothing. "But this dinner," I said, "was never about humiliation." Vanessa frowned. "What does that mean?" Daniel's breathing had slowed now, his attention completely fixed on me. "Because while you were walking into this restaurant," I continued, "the board was already reviewing the documents I sent them." Daniel's voice came out lower this time. "What documents?" I leaned forward slightly. "The ones showing exactly how exposed the company is right now." Daniel shook his head. "You're exaggerating." I met his eyes. "No," I said calmly. "I'm documenting." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before it. Daniel's fingers tightened against the table. "You're destroying the company just to prove a point," he said. I watched him for several seconds before answering. Then I spoke quietly. "No," I said. "I'm saving it." Daniel frowned. "From what?" I held his gaze. "From you." Daniel stared at me after I said it. "From you." For a moment he didn't move at all. The anger that had filled his face seconds earlier seemed to stall, replaced by something heavier, something closer to disbelief. Around us, the restaurant continued its quiet evening rhythm. A waiter passed behind Daniel, carrying a tray of empty glasses, the faint clink of glass briefly filling the silence between us, but neither of us looked away. Vanessa shifted uneasily in her chair, clearly unsettled by the tension that had settled over the table. "I'm sorry," she said cautiously, "but I still don't understand how freezing the company's accounts saves anything." Daniel leaned back slowly, his rigid posture loosening for the first time that evening, though the tension in his face remained. "It doesn't," he said flatly. "It cripples the company." His eyes returned to me again. "Unless that's the goal." I shook my head calmly. "Freezing accounts doesn't destroy a company," I said. "It stops the bleeding." Daniel gave a short, humorless breath. "Bleeding?" "Yes." Vanessa looked between us again, her confusion deepening. "What bleeding?" Daniel answered before I could. "She thinks the company is in financial trouble." I held his gaze. "You know it is." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. You're exaggerating. I reached toward the phone he had placed on the table earlier and gently slid it back toward him. The screen had dimmed, but the report he had been reading clearly hadn't left his mind. The board saw the same numbers I did, I said quietly. 3/4 of aggressive expansion financed by short-term liquidity, debt moved through shell investments, capital transfers the board never saw. Vanessa looked stunned. That sounds illegal, Daniel's voice sharpened immediately. It's strategic financing. It's exposure, I replied. Daniel shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. You've always been overly cautious. No, I said calmly. I've always been the one reading the balance sheets. For several seconds, Daniel didn't respond. The silence between us felt heavier than before. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. Wait, she said slowly. If the board saw those documents, what happens now? Daniel didn't answer. His attention was still fixed on me. The board will meet tomorrow morning, I said. But the control clause already activated the emergency protections. Daniel frowned. Meaning? I met his gaze without hesitation. Meaning the company's liquidity is frozen until the investigation finishes, I said. And executive authority is temporarily transferred. Daniel's voice dropped lower. Transferred to who? I didn't rush the answer. For a moment I simply looked at him, remembering the man he had been 20 years ago, brilliant, ambitious, reckless in ways that once felt exciting instead of dangerous. Then I spoke. To the primary beneficiary of the controlling investment structure. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. Daniel already knew the answer before I finished speaking. You, he said quietly. I nodded once. For several seconds, Daniel said nothing. The realization settled slowly across his face. You planned this, he said finally. I shook my head gently. No. Daniel's voice hardened again. You sent those documents tonight. Yes. And you froze the accounts tonight. Yes. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying my face as if trying to see the woman he thought he knew inside the one sitting across from him now. Then you absolutely planned this. I held his gaze for a moment before answering. No, I said quietly. I prepared for it. Vanessa looked at me in disbelief. Prepared for what? I glanced briefly at Daniel before replying. For the moment when the company needed someone to protect it from the person running it. Daniel let out a slow breath. And the anniversary dinner? He asked. I gave a small shrug. That part, I said calmly, was your idea. For the first time that evening, Daniel had no reply. The quiet murmur of the restaurant returned around us, glasses clinking and voices rising and falling in soft conversation. I picked up my napkin, placed it neatly beside my plate, and stood. Daniel watched me carefully as I reached for my coat. Where are you going? He asked. I slipped my arms into the coat and paused beside the table. Tomorrow morning, I said quietly. I'll be sitting at the head of that board meeting. Then I looked down at him one last time, and that's when you'll finally understand why I toasted your bankruptcy tonight. When I look back at everything that happened that night, I realize the story was never really about revenge. It was about clarity. For years I stayed silent, believing loyalty meant enduring everything. Disrespect, secrecy, even humiliation. But silence does not save a marriage, and it certainly does not protect a future. If there is one lesson in my story, it is this. Never give away your awareness just to keep the peace. Pay attention to what is happening around you in your relationship, in your finances, in the life you are building with someone. Love should never require you to close your eyes. Another lesson is about preparation. Too many people wait until the moment of crisis to start protecting themselves. By then, the damage is already done. Strength is not about reacting emotionally when everything collapses. It is about quietly understanding your position long before that moment arrives. And perhaps the hardest truth is this. Respect matters more than appearances. A marriage can survive arguments, difficult years, even mistakes. But the moment respect disappears, the foundation begins to crack. When someone chooses humiliation over partnership, they are already walking away from the relationship whether they admit it or not. So if you take anything from this story, remember 3 things. Protect your dignity. Understand the power you hold in your own life, and never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has finally decided they will not be underestimated anymore.